Have you ever noticed how quickly you assume what something means when you don't actually have all the factual information? Let's say you don't hear back from someone you've been hoping to hear from, and you immediately conclude that they don't care about you, or that there's something wrong with you, or something new feels excited and unfamiliar at the same time, and before you've even had time to explore it, you've already decided it probably isn't for you. Especially after a long-term relationship ending, assumptions like these can feel incredibly convincing. And perhaps that's what makes assumptions so difficult to identify, because a lot of times they feel like facts. That's why it's so important to understand yourself more deeply, to learn how to inspect your experiences more carefully, and to become more intentional about the meanings you assign to what you discover about yourself. But before you ever arrive at interpretation or decision making, I want you to hear this clearly. Sometimes the assumptions you're making influence the way you interpret what happened and the conclusions you draw about yourself, your experiences, and your future. Think about it. Assumptions have a habit of disappearing into the background, while their conclusions draw your attention and take center stage. You don't usually find yourself saying, "I'm making an assumption that this opportunity isn't meant for me." Instead, you simply conclude and decide, "This opportunity isn't for me." Similarly, you don't consciously make a decision to assume that because you're feeling uncertain about your future, something must be wrong with you. You simply conclude, "I guess I'm not ready yet." Assumptions usually arrive disguised as facts, conclusions, or explanations that you've simply stopped questioning in your day-to-day life. During my 12-year career as a structural engineer, I learned that assumptions were necessary to carry out certain calculations. Every engineering analysis began with assumptions about loads, material behavior, environmental conditions, and about the structure's performance under certain circumstances. And one of the most valuable lessons engineering taught me is this: you can perform a complete and complex analysis and still arrive at the wrong conclusion if one of your original assumptions was incorrect. The calculations themselves may be absolutely accurate. The interpretation may even make complete sense. But if the assumption was flawed from the start, everything built upon it will be flawed as well. And I wonder how often you've been working incredibly hard to understand yourself more deeply, while unknowingly building certain conclusions about yourself upon assumptions you haven't had the time to inspect. Maybe you assumed that because something feels unfamiliar, it must not be right for you. You may have started to think that because this season of your life looks different than what you imagined, it must mean something has gone wrong. Or perhaps you've come to believe that because something feels uncomfortable, it automatically needs to be avoided rather than explored with curiosity and due diligence. And here's what's fascinating about assumptions. They're rarely dramatic, but they're definitely sneaky. They're the story that quietly fills in the blanks whenever life hasn't given you all of the information yet. That's why sometimes uncertainty is simply uncertainty, and discomfort is just discomfort. And yet, it's human nature to want to assign meaning to our feelings before we have the full picture of what our feelings mean. That's perfectly normal. You make assumptions every day, whether you realize it or not. For example, you may assume that when you get into your car, it will start. You expect that the person you've made plans with will show up. You even subconsciously assume that the bridge you're driving across was designed properly. That's why assumptions themselves aren't good or bad. But they can become problematic when they become quote unquote truths that you've stopped questioning. So, how many assumptions have you been carrying about yourself for so long that they've simply become part of your identity? Truly think about that for a moment. Sometimes assumptions sound like, this is just who I am now. Relationships just aren't for me. I tried. I've been this way for as long as I can remember. And many of the conclusions about yourself most definitely originated during a season of your life that no longer exists. Perhaps they were formed during a difficult relationship that ended, or they developed when you were emotionally exhausted and simply doing the best you can with the information you had at the time. Or maybe they came from conclusions you drew about yourself years ago that you've never gone back and inspected since. In engineering, assumptions are never simply made to be forgotten. They're documented, questioned, and revisited as needed if new information comes to light. Because they're only useful for as long as they're supported by the available information. Which means assumptions aren't meant to become permanent simply because they've been around for a long time. Because maybe your circumstances have changed over the last few years, and your understanding of yourself has changed as well. But when you become aware of this, do you finally stop and think whether the stories you've accepted as facts are actually true? Do you become more willing to ask better questions like, when did I first begin believing this about myself? Is this actually true, or has it simply felt true for too long? Does this assumption still deserve a place in the life I'm living today? Because assumptions have a way of following us into seasons of life they were never designed to accompany us through. Sometimes what began as a perfectly understandable explanation for a particular season of your life becomes a permanent conclusion about who you are today. And I'm not saying that you need to stop making assumptions altogether or to become suspicious of every thought that crosses your mind. What I am encouraging you to do is simply become curious enough to recognize that not everything you've believed about yourself deserves to become part of your identity simply because you've believed it for a long time. Because assumptions are only meant to help us make sense of incomplete information. That's all. They're just not meant to become lifelong truths or self-identities that determine what's possible for your future. And here's the question I want to leave you with today. What assumptions about yourself have you adopted for so long that you've stopped questioning whether they're even true anymore? Because perhaps one of the most important things you'll ever learn to inspect isn't simply what happened in your past. It's what you've quietly assumed about yourself along the way. If today's message resonated with you, hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, or share this video with another woman who may need to hear it today. Thank you for being here on Irina's Avenue, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye for now.